Above 8,000 meters, the human body begins to die. Not slowly, not dramatically, not with warning. It simply begins the process of shutting itself down. System by system, in a sequence that has been documented by researchers and experienced by climbers and described in accounts that all arrive at the same conclusion. The human body was not built for this altitude. It was not built for anywhere close to this altitude. And the mountain that sits above 8,000 meters for its final 849 meters, the mountain that requires climbers to spend hours or days in this zone to reach its summit and return, is the most efficient killing machine that geology has ever produced. Everest kills in specific ways. It kills through the storms that develop faster than forecasts can predict and deliver winds strong enough to strip a tent from the mountain in minutes. And temperatures cold enough to kill an exposed person in less than an hour. It kills through the ice that falls from the seracs above the route without warning at any hour of the day or night. It kills through the slow suffocation of oxygen depletion that impairs judgment before it impairs movement, so that a climber who is dying may not know they are dying until the point where doing something about it is no longer possible. It kills through exhaustion that accumulates across days of effort at altitude until a body that was at the edge of its capacity reaches a point past the edge and cannot return. And it kills through decisions, the decisions made by people whose brains are operating on a fraction of the oxygen required for clear thinking, in conditions where the consequences of a wrong decision are permanent. The bodies left on the mountain are the evidence of all of these mechanisms. They are preserved by the cold in the positions and the clothing of the moments when the mountain made its final decision about them. Some of them are visible from the climbing routes. Some have been there for decades. Some are identified and some are not. All of them were people who came to this mountain believing that what they had was sufficient, and all of them were wrong, by a margin that the mountain measured and found inadequate and kept. This is the story of the zone where humans were never meant to survive, the bodies it has collected, the storms that created them, and the specific merciless physiological process by which the highest place on Earth converts human ambition into human remains. To understand what the death zone does to a body, you have to start with the air. At sea level, the atmosphere contains roughly 21% oxygen at a pressure sufficient to force that oxygen through the walls of the lungs and into the bloodstream in quantities the body needs to function. At the summit of Everest, at 8,849 meters, the atmospheric pressure is approximately 1/3 of what it is at sea level. The air still contains 21% oxygen, but the pressure driving that oxygen into the bloodstream is so low that the body receives roughly 1/3 of what it needs simply to stay alive. Every cell in the body, every organ, every muscle, and every neuron runs on oxygen delivered through the blood. Reduce that delivery to 1/3 of the required amount, and the body compensates as long as it can, then begins to fail in a sequence determined by which systems can tolerate oxygen deprivation longest. The brain fails first in functional terms, long before it fails in clinical terms. The neurons that govern judgment, risk assessment, and self-awareness are among the most oxygen-sensitive in the body. A climber whose blood oxygen saturation has dropped to the levels measured in climbers above 8,000 meters is a climber whose capacity for accurate self-assessment has been significantly compromised. They may believe they are making good decisions when they are not. They may believe they are moving efficiently when they have slowed to a dangerous pace. They may believe the weather is acceptable when it is not. They may feel warm when they are in the early stages of hypothermia. The particular cruelty of the death zone is that it removes the cognitive tools needed to recognize danger at the same time that it places a person in maximum danger. Cerebral edema, the accumulation of fluid in and around the brain, produces headaches of a severity that few people who have not experienced altitude sickness can imagine, followed by confusion, loss of coordination, and in its later stages, hallucinations. The hallucination that has been reported by enough climbers above 8,000 meters to be considered characteristic of the environment is the presence of a companion who does not exist. A figure walking alongside, a voice offering advice or encouragement, a hand felt on the shoulder in the dark. Climbers have reported this presence on Everest, on K2, on other extreme peaks. It has been reported by solo climbers in other extreme conditions, by shipwreck survivors and polar explorers and long-distance runners near the end of their endurance. The experience is generally not frightening. The presence is felt as helpful, as company, as something sharing the difficulty. Several climbers believed the third man guided them to safety when they were lost. Several of those climbers were lost in ways that should not have produced survival. The third man remains unexplained. Pulmonary edema is the filling of the lungs with fluid that leaks from the capillaries in response to the low oxygen environment. It begins as a dry cough that develops over hours into a productive cough, bringing up fluid and eventually into a bubbling or gurgling sound audible in the chest that indicates the air spaces where oxygen exchange should be occurring are filling with liquid. A climber with developed high-altitude pulmonary edema cannot absorb enough oxygen to maintain function even at the reduced levels available in the death zone. The treatment is immediate descent. Above 8,000 meters, immediate descent is frequently not immediately possible. There is no helicopter that can hover at the summit of Everest. There is no rescue team that can reach the upper mountain in the time available. There is only the option of descending under one's own power, or not descending at all. People have died of pulmonary edema within sight of a camp they could not reach. Frostbite on the upper mountain begins in the extremities, the fingers and toes and nose and ears, and progresses inward as the body reduces blood flow to the skin and outer tissues to preserve the core temperature of the organs that must keep functioning. The cold on the upper mountain, compounded by wind that accelerates heat loss far beyond what the temperature alone would produce, strips warmth from exposed surfaces with a speed that turns carelessness into permanent injury within minutes. Climbers who remove a glove to adjust equipment and then cannot replace it because their fingers have lost the dexterity to operate the fastenings have lost fingers. Climbers who push back a hood briefly in wind have lost ears. The body's response to extreme cold, shutting down circulation to the periphery, is a survival mechanism that preserves the life at the cost of the extremities. It is a successful mechanism in the sense that it allows people to survive situations that would otherwise be fatal. It is an expensive mechanism in the sense of what it costs to have survived. The combination of these factors, oxygen deprivation, cerebral swelling, pulmonary flooding, and frostbite, operating simultaneously on a body that has already spent days at high altitude depleting its reserves, is what kills people on Everest. Not usually one factor alone, usually several in combination, each one reducing the margin available to manage the others, until the margin runs out. The storms that deliver the worst of these outcomes to the greatest number of people in the shortest time arrive on Everest from the south, driven by the weather systems that move across the Bay of Bengal and the Indian subcontinent during the period preceding the monsoon. The summit window that allows expeditions to attempt the mountain in May exists because the jet stream, which in winter sits directly above the summit at speeds that make survival on the upper mountain impossible, shifts northward in late spring and stays north until the monsoon arrives and closes the mountain under heavy snowfall. In the weeks between the jet stream's departure and the monsoon's arrival, there are periods of relatively stable weather during which summit attempts are possible. These windows are narrow, sometimes only a few days in a season, and they are shared by all expeditions on the mountain simultaneously. The difficulty is that the boundary between the summit window and the weather outside, it is not a clean line. The systems that produce Everest's worst storms can develop faster than the forecasting technology available to expedition teams can reliably predict, particularly in the compressed time scales of the upper mountain, where a change in conditions that would be a nuisance at lower altitudes becomes a survival situation within minutes. The storm of May 10th and 11th, 1996, was preceded by forecasts that suggested deteriorating conditions, but did not adequately convey the speed with which the deterioration would occur or the severity of what would follow. Expeditions that had been operating cautiously all season made judgments based on the available information that the summit was achievable that day. The mountain provided different information at a time when the people who needed it most were above 8,000 meters and could not act on it fast enough. The 1996 disaster did not happen because experienced people made obvious mistakes. It happened because experienced people made reasonable decisions based on incomplete information in an environment where the cost of incomplete information is paid immediately and in full. Rob Hall, one of the most experienced commercial guides on the mountain, had reached the summit of Everest 4 times before 1996. He had developed a reputation for conservative decision-making, for strict turnaround times, for prioritizing client safety over summit achievement. On May 10th, he waited at the summit for a client who was moving slowly, because leaving a client on the summit alone was not something he was willing to do. That decision, made from the deepest instinct of a professional guide, whose entire identity was built around bringing people home safely, cost him the time he needed to descend before the storm arrived at its full force. Doug Hansen was the client Hall waited for. Hansen was a postal worker from Washington State, making his second attempt at Everest after turning back just below the summit the previous year. The closeness of that previous failure had stayed with him through 12 months and across the preparation for a second attempt. When he reached the summit on May 10th, it was late in the afternoon. The turnaround time had passed. Hall stayed with him. By the time both men began their descent, the visibility had dropped and the wind had risen to the speeds that make movement on the exposed ridge above 8,000 meters a question of whether the gusts will pull a person from the mountain before they can brace against them. Hansen died during the descent. The specific circumstances of his death have never been fully reconstructed because Hall, who was with him, was later incapacitated, and Hall's account of those final hours on the mountain died with him on the south summit. Hall spent the night in the open at approximately 8,750 meters on the south summit, the subsidiary peak below the main summit, connected to the outside world through a radio link that Base Camp maintained through the night and the following day. The temperature on the south summit that night was far below the threshold at which exposed survival is possible without shelter. Hall had shelter from a small rocky depression that partially blocked the wind. He had supplemental oxygen until the canister was exhausted. He had frostbite developing in his hands severe enough to prevent him from operating his equipment. He had the radio. Rescue attempts were made. A team of Sherpa climbers left Camp 4 with additional oxygen and supplies, attempting to reach the south summit and bring Hall down. They turned back below the summit in conditions that made continuing without additional oxygen impossible. They had not brought enough oxygen to continue. The organization of the rescue under conditions of storm and darkness and the physiological impairment of everyone involved at that altitude produced the particular kind of failure that extreme mountain environments specialize in. Not a failure of effort or intention, but a failure of logistics and timing in conditions where logistics and timing operate at a fraction of their normal efficiency. Hall spoke to his wife Jan Arnold in Christchurch, New Zealand, through a satellite phone relay arranged by his base camp team. Jan Arnold was 7 months pregnant. The conversations between them were heard by base camp staff, who have described them in subsequent accounts with the particular care of people who are describing something that belongs to someone else and that they were given by circumstances they had no control over, the unwanted privilege of witnessing. Hall told his wife that she should not worry about him. He told her about practical matters, about arrangements she would need to make. He told her she should not delay remarrying after he was gone, because she was young and she would have a long life ahead, and there was no reason to spend it alone. He suggested the name Sarah for their child, if it was a girl. He told her he loved her. The radio connection weakened during the second night and was eventually lost. His body was found the following season in the position where he had been sitting when last heard, on the south summit at 8,750 meters, facing the direction of the main summit. He had not moved. He had not been able to move. He is still there. His daughter, born after his death, is named Sarah. Scott Fisher was the other guide who died that night. Fisher had founded the expedition company Mountain Madness and had reached the summit of Everest once before without supplemental oxygen, a physiological feat that requires either exceptional genetic predisposition to altitude or a level of acclimatization impossible to achieve in a single season, or both. In 1996, he was guiding a separate expedition on the same route, and the two companies had developed arrangements to share resources and coordinate their summit attempts. Fisher had been showing symptoms of altitude sickness for several days before the summit attempt. He had been moving slowly. His Sherpa guide Lobsang Jangbu had been exhausted by an earlier rescue operation and was less able to support Fisher on the summit day than would have been optimal under the circumstances. Fisher descended from the summit slower than the others. Lobsang, who had stayed close to him, was eventually compelled to descend ahead of Fisher by the deteriorating conditions and his own state of exhaustion. A Russian guide from another expedition encountered Fisher on the southeast ridge, examined him, and reported that he was beyond any help that could be provided at that altitude without resources the Russian guide did not have. Fisher died on the ridge. He was 40 years old. He had a wife and 2 children in Seattle. Lobsang, who had been with him through the summit day, and who carried the weight of Fisher's death alongside his own survival, spoke about Fisher in interviews for years afterward, with the specific grief of someone who was present and could not change what happened, and could not stop thinking about whether something different was possible. Eight people died on Everest in those 36 hours. The accounts produced by survivors and journalists present on the mountain generated a literature of catastrophe that brought the 1996 disaster to an audience measured in the tens of millions across multiple languages. The mountain that had been known primarily to mountaineers and adventure enthusiasts became, in the years after 1996, a subject of broad fascination that found its way into schools, boardrooms, and conversations far removed from any alpine context. And that fascination produced its own consequences, because the attention brought by the disaster translated into increased demand for Everest expeditions in the years that followed. More people wanted to attempt the mountain because of the deaths, not in spite of them. The commercial expansion of Everest climbing that accelerated after 1996 produced new categories of risk that the mountain's earlier history had not encountered at significant scale. Congestion became a documented cause of death. The standard South Col route uses fixed ropes installed each season by Sherpa teams, and all climbers on the route are attached to the same ropes. When the summit window opens and hundreds of expeditions attempt the summit within the same few days of favorable weather, the result is a queue that moves at the speed of its slowest member. Time spent stationary on the fixed ropes in the death zone is time spent depleting the supplemental oxygen that keeps a climber's physiology functional above 8,000 meters. A climber who budgeted their oxygen for a certain ascent time and then spends additional hours in a queue may reach the summit with insufficient oxygen for the descent. In 2019, photographs showed hundreds of climbers queued on the southeast ridge, barely moving, in a line that stretched for hundreds of meters in the death zone. "11 people died that season. The photographs and the deaths produced a public debate about whether there should be limits on the number of permits issued. Nepal continued issuing permits. The revenue they generate is significant. The bodies that remain on the mountain above 8,000 meters number in the dozens. They are distributed across both the south and north routes, in positions determined by where the people in them stopped moving and the cold preserved them. Recovering a body from above 8,000 meters requires a major operation involving multiple experienced Sherpa climbers, specialized equipment, additional oxygen for the recovery team, significant financial resources, and days of work in conditions where the recovery team faces the same risks that killed the person they are trying to bring down. The cost of such operations, in money and in risk to the recovery team, means that most bodies are left where they are. Nepal has organized occasional official recovery operations that have brought down some of the dead. The total recovered represents a fraction of the total, who have died at altitudes where recovery is possible only at extreme cost. The most well-known of the bodies is the one that has been visible from the northeast ridge route for nearly 3 decades, the Indian climber who died near a small cave at approximately 8,500 meters in 1996 and whose bright green high-altitude mountaineering boots gave the location its common name, Green Boots Cave. The identity of the climber was eventually established as a member of an Indian expedition that year, but the name Green Boots Cave persists in climbing accounts and route descriptions because it is useful, because landmarks on the upper mountain that can be identified in poor visibility are worth knowing, and because the mountain does not offer many landmarks at that altitude other than the ones it keeps. David Sharp died in Green Boots Cave in 2006, having taken shelter there after his solo summit attempt left him unable to continue his descent. He had reached the summit, but had spent too long above 8,000 meters and had insufficient oxygen for what remained. He sat in the cave through the night and through the following morning, during which dozens of climbers passed him on their way to the summit and back. The accounts of what climbers who passed him did and did not do have been disputed and defended in the decade and a half since his death. The core facts are not disputed. He was there. He was dying. The climbers who passed him were themselves operating in the death zone with limited oxygen and limited time before their own margins became critical. The ethical question of what was owed to David Sharp by the people who passed him in the cave is a question that cannot be answered cleanly from sea level, because it involves trade-offs between the lives of multiple people in conditions that sea level judgment is not equipped to evaluate. What the situation at Green Boots Cave in 2006 illustrated, alongside the 1996 disaster and every other catastrophic season in Everest history, is that the mountain does not create the conditions for clean moral choices. It creates conditions in which all available choices carry significant costs, and the people making them are operating at a fraction of their normal cognitive capacity. The decisions that look worst in retrospect were frequently made by people doing the best they could with what they had in the time available, and the decisions that look best in retrospect were frequently made by people who got lucky, who found that the conditions they gambled on accepting were manageable rather than fatal. The margin between those two outcomes is not consistently determined by the quality of the decision. Sometimes it is determined by chance, by the particular timing of a gust of wind, by whether the serac above the route chose that hour or a different one, by whether the storm strengthened an hour earlier or an hour later. The storms that have shaped Everest's death toll are not random events. They follow patterns driven by the same monsoon system that determines the summit window's existence. But within those patterns, their specific timing, the precise moment when wind speeds cross from manageable to unsurvivable, the exact hour when visibility drops below the threshold needed for safe navigation, has proven resistant to prediction at the precision required to make reliable decisions about summit attempts. The forecasting has improved significantly since 1996, when the technology available to expedition teams was far less sophisticated than what exists now. Modern expeditions receive detailed meteorological forecasts from services that specialize in high-altitude weather prediction and that use satellite data, atmospheric modeling, and historical pattern analysis to provide guidance that was not available to the teams on the mountain in the early commercial era. The forecasts are better. The window between a good forecast and a bad outcome has narrowed. It has not been closed. The wind on the upper mountain operates on scales that make its effect on a human body difficult to describe without experiencing it. Wind speeds at the summit have been recorded above 280 kilometers per hour, roughly 175 miles per hour. At those speeds, in temperatures that can reach minus 60 degrees Celsius on the upper mountain, with wind chill producing effective temperatures well below that, the wind does not feel like wind, in the sense that people who have experienced wind at lower altitudes understand the word. It feels like something with mass and intent, something that is specifically trying to remove a person from the mountain in the most direct way available to it. Climbers caught in extreme winds on the upper mountain describe being unable to stand, being lifted partially from the ground, being pressed against the slope by gusts so violent that breathing against them requires effort. The frostbite that whined at those speeds produces on exposed skin occurs in seconds rather than minutes. The erosion of body heat that it produces through clothing rated for extreme cold still occurs fast enough to be dangerous before symptoms are recognized. The bodies that storms have left on the mountain have their own specific geography. The South Col, the saddle at approximately 7,950 meters between Everest and the neighboring peak Lhotse, is where Camp 4 sits and where climbers spend the night before summit attempts. It is also one of the most wind-exposed locations on the southern route, a flat, open area that the Everest winds can cross without obstruction, and it has been the site of storms that trapped expeditions for days, destroying tents and depleting oxygen supplies and producing the particular desperation of people who are too high to survive indefinitely and too exhausted to descend safely. The bodies of climbers who died attempting to descend from the South Col in storm conditions, who made it out of their tents and then could not make it further, have been found on the slopes below the col in positions indicating falls or simply the point where forward movement ceased. The southeast ridge above the South Col, the final section of the standard route before the summit pyramid, is exposed on both sides to winds that can arrive from different directions, simultaneously when weather systems interact above the summit. Climbers on the ridge during deteriorating conditions describe the experience of navigating a path barely wide enough for a human body. With a drop of several thousand meters on the left and a drop of several thousand meters on the right, in winds strong enough to affect balance, invisibility reduced to the cone of light from a headlamp, with supplemental oxygen delivering air through a mask that fogs in the cold, and that must be cleared periodically at the cost of a hand removed from an ice axe. The technical difficulty of the ridge under these conditions is not the difficulty of the rock or the ice. It is the difficulty of maintaining the concentration required to avoid a fatal error while the body is being systematically compromised by altitude and the weather is reducing every margin available for error. The Hillary Step, the near vertical section of rock just below the summit at approximately 8,790 meters, was for many years the technical crux of the Southside route. It required using handholds and footholds in rock at an altitude where the effort of a single difficult move can push a depleted climber past their limit. The step was altered significantly by the 2015 Nepal earthquake that also affected the Khumbu Icefall, and what remains of the original feature varies depending on the season's snow conditions. Fixed ropes on the step have made it passable for climbers who would not otherwise have the technical skill or remaining capacity to free climb it at that altitude. The fixed ropes also create the queue that forms below the step when multiple expeditions attempt the summit on the same day. The queue that concentrates the most depleted climbers at the highest altitude for the longest duration. Above the step, the summit ridge leads to the top in a final section that every climber who has been there describes as both impossibly close and impossibly far. Close because the summit is visible, the goal that has organized months of preparation and weeks of effort on the mountain is 100 meters away. Far because 100 meters at 8,800 meters in the conditions that typically exist there, at the end of a summit day that has already lasted 8 or 10 or 12 hours, requires an effort that the remaining reserves of a depleted body cannot guarantee will be completed. Climbers have turned back within 100 meters of the summit. They have turned back within 50 meters. They have turned back with the summit visible and close enough that the decision to turn back was among the most difficult of their lives and was also, in some cases, the decision that allowed them to have more decisions afterward. The people who die coming down from the summit, which is where most Everest deaths occur, are people who completed the ascent and then encountered conditions on the descent that they could not manage. Some of them were simply too depleted by the ascent to have enough left for the descent. Some of them were caught by weather that deteriorated faster than expected. Some of them made navigational errors in conditions of poor visibility, taking routes that led away from the camps and toward faces and ridges where recovery was not possible. Some of them sat down to rest and could not get up. Some of them fell. The mountain below the summit is not less dangerous than the mountain above the approach camps. It is the same mountain that killed the people on the way up, with the same altitude and the same weather and the same cold, encountered by people who have less physical reserve than when they started. The Northeast Ridge Road on the Tibetan side of Everest has its own history and its own dead, separate in some details from the South side history, but sharing the fundamental features of altitude, weather, and the limits of human endurance. The north side was the route of the early British expeditions, the route of Mallory and Irvine, the route where the bodies of early 20th century climbers have been found preserved in states that allow researchers to reconstruct the details of clothing and equipment. used in an era when the technology for surviving the upper mountain was far less developed than what exists now. Mallory's body, found in 1999 at 8,155 meters, was examined by the search team with the care and the discomfort of people handling someone's history. His clothing was lighter than what modern climbers wear. His boots were leather. His oxygen system, when he was using it, delivered oxygen at rates lower than what supplemental oxygen systems provide today. He was attempting the summit of the world's highest mountain, with equipment that modern climbers would not consider adequate for the upper camps. Whether he reached the summit before he died is a question the mountain has not answered and shows no signs of answering. The camera that could answer it has not been found. Irvine's body has not been found. The evidence is incomplete and will remain incomplete until something changes on the north face at the altitudes where the two men were last seen. And the mountain changes slowly enough that changes at those altitudes are measured in decades. What the mountain has collected, across a century of attempts and across 300 lives, is a record of what happens when human ambition encounters a place that exceeds human design. The bodies are the record. They are not monuments or memorials or warnings. Because the mountain did not place them there as messages, they are simply the evidence of a process that has been operating since the first person attempted the upper slopes and found what was there. The process is the same process it has always been. The altitude and the cold and the storms operate identically for every person who enters the death zone. The outcome varies because the people who enter it vary in their preparation and their physiology and their judgment and their luck. But the process is constant. The mountain applies the same test to everyone. The test is whether what a person has, everything they have, is sufficient for what they have decided to do. The mountain grades on a curve with two possible outcomes. And for 300 people, the outcome has been the same. The north side of Everest requires climbers to cross the Tibetan Plateau at altitude before they even reach the mountain. The approach from the north begins at a roadhead in Tibet at roughly 5,000 meters, already higher than any peak in the Alps, and ascends through the Rongbuk Valley to the North Face Base Camp at 5,150 meters. The landscape of the northern approach is severe in a way that is different from the southern approach through the Khumbu Valley. There are no forests, no villages with tea houses and prayer flags and the sounds of community life. There is the plateau, brown and flat and enormous, and the wind that crosses it unimpeded from the west, and the mountain rising from the valley head in a triangle of rock and ice that is visible for many miles before it is reached. Advanced Base Camp on the north side sits at 6,400 meters, reached by a glacier approach that passes beneath the massive north face and provides an unobstructed view of the northeast ridge where Mallory and Irvine were last seen. The camps above Advanced Base Camp are established on the ridge itself, at altitudes where the camps on the south side are positioned on the col and the upper slopes. The north side route requires climbers to traverse the ridge at altitude with exposure on both sides and the 3 steps to negotiate in the final approach to the summit. The first step at approximately 8,500 meters and the second step at 8,610 meters are both technical sections at altitudes where technical climbing demands effort that the body can barely produce. The third step at around 8,700 meters is less technical, but occurs at the point in a summit day when everything remaining in a climber's reserves is already committed. The second step, with the aluminum ladder installed by the Chinese in 1975, is the feature that has made the north side route possible for the range of climbers who now attempt it. Before the ladder, passing the step required climbing 15 meters of near vertical rock at 8,610 meters using only the rock itself, without the aid of a fixed point at the top. The first Chinese team to climb the north side in 1960 described the effort required to pass this section as the most demanding physical effort of the entire climb. The ladder changes this. The ladder makes the step climbable by people who do not have the technical skill to free climb it at that altitude. It also means that a section of the route that once filtered out climbers who lacked the technical ability to continue now passes them through to the difficulties above. The ladder has contributed to both the number of people who reach the summit and the number who die above it. The weather patterns on the north side differ from the south side in their direction and their character. The predominant winds on the north side arrive from the west and northwest, driven by the jet stream that in winter pins itself directly over the summit at speeds that make the upper mountain uninhabitable, and that in the summit window period moves north of the summit. The storms that develop on the north side can arrive with less warning than those on the south, because the plateau to the north provides less visual indication of approaching weather than the complex topography of the Nepal side. Climbers on the northeast ridge have described weather changes that transformed a clear day into a whiteout, with sustained high winds in under an hour, leaving people at altitude in conditions they had not prepared for, because the preparation had not been possible given the speed of the change. The deaths on the north side include some of the mountain's most significant historical events. Beyond Mallory and Irvine in 1924, the 1922 expedition lost 7 Sherpa climbers in an avalanche on the north face during the descent from a high camp. A 1934 solo attempt by the eccentric English climber Maurice Wilson, who believed he could reach the summit through willpower and fasting without technical experience, ended with his death somewhere on the north face at around 6,400 meters. His body was found by the 1935 British expedition and buried in a crevasse. It has reappeared several times since as the glacier moves and shifts, returning him repeatedly to the surface of the mountain he was trying to climb. The mountain keeps what it takes, but on its own terms, in its own time. The Khumbu Valley on the southern side holds the human history of the mountain in a way that the north side, with its remoteness and its Tibetan context, does not. The Sherpa villages of Namche Bazar, Kumjung, Taim, and Pangboche are the communities that have lived in relationship with the mountain for centuries, long before any outside expedition arrived to attempt it. The monastery at Thiangboche Rebuilt after a fire in 1989, at the same site on the ridge above the Imjakola Valley, where it had stood since 1916, overlooks the valley with the Everest Massif visible above the ridge to the northeast. Monks at Thiang Boche have observed the mountain from this vantage for generations. They have watched the expeditions pass through on their way up and return, some with fewer members than departed. They have performed ceremonies for the dead. They have continued their own practice in the presence of the mountain, without it being the center of their existence in the way it is the center of the expeditions. The Sherpa families who have built the commercial climbing infrastructure of the Khumbu are in many cases now multi-generational in their involvement. A Sherpa whose father guided expeditions in the 1980s may himself be a senior high-altitude guide with 20 seasons of experience, whose son is beginning his own career on the mountain. The knowledge accumulated across those generations, the specific details of route conditions in different seasons, the behavior of the mountain's weather at different altitudes, the particular sections of the route that are most objectively dangerous, is not written down in any guide or encoded in any GPS waypoint. It exists in the bodies and minds of people who have spent more time above 8,000 meters than almost any other group of humans alive. That knowledge has saved clients who would not have survived without it. It has also been unable to save Sherpa climbers who were killed by the mountain in ways that no amount of knowledge could prevent, because some of what the mountain does is not preventable by knowledge. It is simply what the mountain does. The commercial expansion of Everest since the 1990s has produced an economy that the Nepali government depends on significantly. The permit fee for an Everest expedition in 2024 was $11,000 per climber, and a typical commercial expedition may include 8 to 12 paying clients. The total revenue from Everest permits alone generates millions of dollars annually, to which must be added the fees paid for permits for the hundreds of support staff. The fees paid to Sherpa guides and workers at rates that have improved significantly since the 1990s, but remain lower than those paid to equivalent workers in comparable high-risk industries in other countries, and the revenue generated by the entire infrastructure of lodges, tea houses, gear shops, porter services, and helicopter operations that the climbing season supports along the Khumbu Trail from Lukla to base camp. Everest is not simply a mountain, it is an economy, and the deaths that occur on it are a cost that the economy absorbs and continues operating around, because the demand for what the mountain offers does not diminish when people die there. It persists, and in some cases it increases, because the deaths are part of what makes Everest what it is. The environmental cost of this economy is visible on the mountain and in the approaches to it. The Khumbu Trail from Lukla to base camp passes through terrain that now carries signs of its status as one of the most visited trekking routes in Asia, with the specific kind of erosion and waste accumulation that concentrated human traffic produces over decades. Base camp itself, which sits on the Khumbu Glacier and is occupied by hundreds of people for weeks at a time each season, generates waste in quantities that the glacial environment is poorly suited to process. Human waste deposited at altitude in the cold and low oxygen environment decomposes far more slowly than it would at lower elevations, and decades of expeditions have deposited layers of waste that are now being revealed as the glacier's surface melts and lowers. Nepal has implemented regulations requiring expeditions to bring down a minimum weight of waste and to manage human waste through contained disposal systems rather than burial in the glacier. The regulations are enforced with varying degrees of rigor, and the problem persists. The garbage on the upper mountain, abandoned equipment and empty oxygen cylinders and tent remnants and fixed rope sections left from previous seasons has accumulated to the point where cleanup expeditions have been organized specifically to address it. Cleanup teams operating above 8,000 meters face the same altitude constraints as climbing expeditions and can recover only limited quantities of waste per season. The accumulated garbage of decades cannot be removed in a few seasons of cleanup operations. The oxygen cylinders that have been left on the upper mountain number in the thousands. Many of them are from eras when the cylinders were heavier than current designs, and the cost and effort of descending with empty cylinders was weighed against the benefit and found insufficient to compel it. The cylinders remain. They will remain for a long time. The glacier itself is retreating. The Khumbu Glacier has thinned by measurable amounts each decade since systematic measurements began, and the rate of thinning has accelerated in the past 30 years. The surface of the glacier at base camp has lowered to the point where the camp's traditional location is being relocated downhill, the first such relocation in the history of the camp, because the ice beneath the tents has become unstable through surface melting. During the pre-monsoon season, rock and debris that have been locked in the glacier for centuries are being revealed as the ice retreats. The icefall that climbers must cross to reach the upper mountain is changing character as the glacier changes, requiring annual reassessment of routes and rope placements by the icefall doctors. The mountain that future climbers will attempt will be physically different in its glacier coverage from the mountain that exists today, and the mountain today is already different from the mountain that Hillary and Tenzing climbed in 1953. The question of what draws people to Everest, despite everything the mountain has demonstrated it is capable of doing to them, has produced more answers than any other question about any other mountain, and none of the answers are fully satisfying because they are all attempts to explain something that exists at a level below the reach of ordinary explanation. The challenge answers are true, but incomplete. The achievement answers are true, but insufficient. The view from the summit answers are true, but disproportionate to the cost. The proving something to yourself answers are true, but raise the question of what requires proof at this particular altitude, rather than at any of the thousands of other challenging places on Earth. George Mallory's answer, because it is there, given to a New York Times reporter in 1923 in response to a question about why he wanted to climb Everest, has been quoted so many times and in so many contexts that its surface meaning has been worn away by repetition. What Mallory was actually saying, in the fuller context of his letters and journals and public lectures, was something more specific. He was saying that the existence of an extreme difficulty, a difficulty at the absolute limit of what humans could attempt, was itself a call that could not be entirely ignored by a certain kind of person, that not going to the limit when the limit was available would be a different kind of failure than going and not reaching it. The letters he wrote before the 1924 expedition, the expedition on which he disappeared, suggest a person who understood with some clarity that the mountain might keep him and who went anyway, not from ignorance but from a particular relationship, with the extreme that is either admirable or incomprehensible, depending on how the reader stands in relation to their own limits. The people who have climbed Everest without supplemental oxygen, a much smaller group than those who have climbed it with it, occupy a separate category in the mountain's history. Reinhold Messner and Peter Habeler made the first confirmed oxygenless ascent in 1978, reaching the summit via the South Col route and returning to tell accounts that describe the upper mountain in terms of hallucination and near-death experience at the boundary of what their bodies could manage. Messner then climbed the mountain solo in 1980 by the North Face and North Ridge, without oxygen, without Sherpa support, in the monsoon season when the standard expeditions had left the mountain. His account of the solo ascent describes an experience that sits at the furthest edge of what a human body can be asked to do and survive. He descended from the summit nearly incapacitated, navigating by instinct through conditions that should not have allowed navigation, reaching his tent by a process he could not fully reconstruct afterward. He was alone on the upper mountain of the world's highest peak, in the monsoon, without oxygen, and he came back. He has offered various explanations for how. None of them are fully convincing, because the achievement itself is not fully convincing, in the sense that it seems to exceed what should be possible. The winter ascents of Everest represent the furthest extension of the mountain's difficulty into conditions that the human body was designed to survive for even shorter periods than the summit window allows. The jet stream that sits above the summit in winter, at speeds exceeding 250 kilometers per hour, delivering effective temperatures that can approach minus 100 degrees Celsius with wind chill, makes the upper mountain in winter not merely difficult, but categorically beyond what the climbing equipment and physiology of most eras could manage. The first winter ascent was made in February 1980 by Krzysztof Wilicki and Leszek Cici of Poland, two climbers from an era of Polish Himalayan climbing that produced a disproportionate number of extreme high-altitude achievements relative to the country's resources and the conditions in which those achievements were made. They reached the summit in temperatures and winds that their own accounts describe as the edge of what was endurable, made a brief visit to the summit, and descended. The second winter ascent did not occur until 2021, more than 40 years later, when a team of 10 Nepali climbers summited together on January 16th, deliberately choosing to arrive as a group rather than have a single person reach the top first, in a gesture that reflected both the collective nature of Himalayan climbing at its best and the specific culture of the team involved. The summit temperature that day was approximately minus 60 degrees Celsius without wind chill. The team spent the minimum time at the summit required to document the achievement and descended. All 10 returned to the lower camps. The winter ascent in 2021 occurred because of a combination of advances in forecasting technology, improvements in equipment, the specific physiological capacity of the climbers involved, and the support structure that high-altitude experience in the Nepalese climbing community had built over decades. It was not a casual achievement. It was the result of multiple previous failed attempts by teams from various countries over 40 years, each attempt adding to the knowledge of what was required and what was not yet available. The mountain waited with its characteristic patience while the attempts accumulated and failed, and then it let the right team through on the right day with the right preparation. The mountain waits with the same patience for everything. It waited while the early British expeditions mapped the routes and established the altitude records that fell each decade until they stopped falling because the summit itself had been reached. It waited while the commercial era developed and the queues formed and the deaths accumulated into the hundreds. It waited while the cleanup expeditions removed fractions of the waste it had accumulated. It waited while the glacier retreated beneath its base camps. It waits now, at 8,849 meters, for the May window to open and the expeditions to arrive and the process to begin again. The process that has been the same since the first attempt. The altitude, the cold, the storms, the specific, comprehensive, impartial test of whether what a person has is enough for what they have decided to do. The mountain applies this test without preference or prejudice. It does not care about the money spent, the training completed, the experience accumulated, the reputation held, the family waiting at lower altitude, the ambition driving the attempt, or the importance attributed to the outcome by the person being tested. It applies its test through physics and physiology and meteorology, and it records the results in the positions of the bodies left on its slopes. The test has been passed thousands of times. It has been failed 300 times. The ratio is high enough that the attempt is survivable. It is not high enough to make the attempt safe. And the difference between survivable and safe is the specific space that Everest occupies in the catalog of things that humans choose to do. The storms will come again this May. The Icefall doctors will fix the ropes through the Khumbu Icefall before the first client arrives at base camp. The Sherpa climbers will carry loads through the Icefall to the camps above while their clients sleep. The queue will form below the Hillary Step. On the first day, the weather allows summit attempts, and somewhere above 8,000 meters, in the zone where the air is too thin for the human body to survive indefinitely, people will make the decisions that the mountain will measure. Some of those decisions will be sufficient, some will not. The bodies that result from the ones that are not will join the ones already there, preserved by the cold, in the place where the mountain kept them, at the altitude where they reach their limit. The mountain will still be there in the morning. It always is. You have stood in the zone where the human body was never meant to survive and looked at what the mountain keeps. Now, see the full scale of what surrounds it. Click now to explore Everest, the mountain that has swallowed 300 lives, and discover the complete story of the mountain that measures what humans are made of, from its first attempt to its last death.